De Gaulle, in fact, stomps out in some of these discussions. And as he does so, Churchill says, just look at him. His country has given up fighting. He himself is a refugee. And if we turn him down, he's finished. But just look at him. Look at him. He might be Stalin with 200 divisions behind his words. And that's almost the difficulty of working with a man of this huge theatrical sense that de Gaulle has, and also this massive sense of the position and significance of France, even though it's in the dust at the moment.
Welcome to Creating Churchill, an alternative biography of soldier, journalist, war leader and greatest Briton, Winston Churchill. His story has been told so many times, his bulldog image has become so familiar, that today Churchill can seem more meme than man. So this podcast series aims to get closer to the real Churchill, seeing him once again as his contemporaries saw him, the people he collaborated or clashed with. I'm Russell Barnes and I'm talking with historian David Reynolds, exploring how Churchill's life and character were shaped by relationships with friends, rivals, enemies and family. In this episode, we turn to one of Winston Churchill's most prickly and turbulent relationships, with the leader of the Free French during World War II and later French President, Charles de Gaulle. I asked David first whether de Gaulle and Churchill, both men with explosive tempers and a strong sense of their own national histories, which for centuries were at loggerheads, were always bound to clash.
Yeah, I think you're right. And it's a clash of positions and personality. De Gaulle landed up in Britain when France surrendered in the middle of June 1940. He wanted to fight on, but was now humiliatingly dependent on Churchill and Churchill's hospitality. And in addition to that, de Gaulle was a really proud French nationalist with a mystical sense of his country's history and its destiny almost. What he called une certaine idée de la France, a certain idea. And certain is both firm but also almost mystical in what he's talking about. It's kind of intangible. So, yeah, he's bound to clash with this British bulldog, if you like, who was now his host. And this clash of position and personality is going to last for the whole war and, equally important, for the legacies for the post-war period afterwards.
Unlike some of the other personalities we've talked about, people like Lloyd George or Stalin, this is a man of very different stature to Winston Churchill. Can you describe what he looked like, where he come from, what he'd done before the Second World War?
Yeah, well, you'd have to look up to him. Everybody would. Literally 6'5", so huge, towering figure and imposing. And then also an absolute gift for caricaturists, long nose. He's a World War I veteran, wounded several times, captured at the Battle of Verdun in 1916. During the interwar years, he's a staff officer. He makes his name as a lecturer in military history who writes about the novelty and the importance of mobile tank warfare at a time when French strategy is all about the defensive. It's about maintaining fixed lines of defense, the Maginot Line, famously.
Yeah.
So in the crisis of June 1940, as the French army is falling apart, de Gaulle is promoted to Undersecretary of National Defense. And then as France falls apart, he has a few meetings with Churchill in London and in Paris. At one point, they help concoct a declaration of unity in a desperate last-ditch effort to try and keep the two countries in the fight together. But it all is falling apart very fast.
And on the 17th of June, French Prime Minister Paul Reynaud resigned. Marshal Pétain sought an armistice with Germany, famously. And Charles de Gaulle took a plane to London. He was effectively almost the last senior Free French general standing.
Yes, he was. There's no other significant French military man or politician who escapes for France and stamps his personality on what he's doing. And de Gaulle takes on, if you like, the whole mantle of resistance. He has this sort of instinctive gut sense of defiance. He says, the defeated are those who accept defeat. In other words, it's all a matter of willpower, and that notion of willpower as being so important in politics is one that he shares with Churchill.
But in the same speech, he does at times sound quite ludicrously unrealistic, saying at one point, I think, the Germans have lost the war. I mean, he sounds like a man in profound shock, unable to really grasp the disaster fully at this point.
Well, yes and no. I mean, he is clearly in shock. This is a horrendous story. I mean, it's unparalleled in French history, really, the complete devastation and debacle, worse than 1870. But he is clear in the broadcast as to why France has reasons for carrying on the war. He says we've got the whole of the French Empire behind us, which is, of course, what Churchill is saying as well about Britain. It's Britain and the Empire are fighting on. De Gaulle says we are allied with the British Empire. And also he emphasizes that France can expect to draw on what he calls the immense material, industrial resources of the United States. So he's got a vision of the strategy. But his problem is really that he's fundamentally powerless. He doesn't come with a substantial number of troops. There are troops that have arrived separately, but he's not at this stage a particularly well-known figure, even within the French army and so on. And, it's not an ideal situation. He's broadcasting from an island that's threatened with invasion, and many would say is going to go the same way as France. And he's a junior general who's challenging the authority of a Marshal of France. Pétain was the great victor of Verdun, so he still has an enormous cachet in France, whereas de Gaulle is a sort of nobody.
And so effectively he's stuck, but the Brits, in a way, are also stuck with him. He's the guy who's there. How does Churchill support him, and why does he do that?
I think he supports him above all in giving him a voice, or more exactly, a microphone. Churchill allows him to broadcast on the BBC to France, overruling the cabinet and the Foreign Office, who are hoping still to reach out to Pétain in some way or other. But I think Churchill respects a man with that sense of defiance, because that's what he's doing against the odds in Britain. And then he, on the 28th of June, so a couple of weeks later, he announces that the British government recognizes de Gaulle as the leader of the Free French forces. And I think he needs to create the impression that Britain and the British Empire are not entirely alone. There are other countries still supporting them and working with them. And also on a personal level, as I say, de Gaulle's solitary struggle appeals to Churchill's romantic feelings and sensibilities. But the problem is that, nobody quite knows who de Gaulle is representing apart from himself. Is he representing the fighting French, a military grouping, as Churchill said? De Gaulle already believes himself to be representing France, la France entière, the totality of France, as he says. In other words, the whole country. He sees himself as the nucleus of a future government when victory is won. And this debate between Churchill and de Gaulle is going to get very difficult and is only resolved as the war progresses.
And Churchill and de Gaulle pretty quickly come to the first big test of their relationship.
Yeah, so on the 3rd of July, 1940, so this is less than a month after France fought an armistice, the Royal Navy attacks ships of the French fleet in harbours around Algiers with the intention of stopping them falling into the hands of the Nazis. And so what that means is that the British ships are shelling naval vessels and crews who a few weeks before were their allies and killing them. And it's a really appalling thing for many French people. De Gaulle himself is furious. And he threatens to give it all up, leave Britain, go off to Canada or something. But then within a few days, he comes round because he says to the French people, we feel grief, we feel anger, but the ships are better destroyed than being used by the enemy. And that's an example of him, as it were, moderating his own fierce patriotism, in recognition of the hard realities of the conflict.
So this would be, I suppose, the first episode of many in which de Gaulle and Churchill were at loggerheads over campaigns, particularly in North Africa. You write in the book about them having a calculating relationship because of this. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, well, there's obviously a certain personal respect growing gradually, but essentially this is a wary and often mistrustful relationship. Throughout 1940 and 41, Britain still keeps up contacts with Vichy government and Vichy forces covertly, quietly, and it's looking to try and rally alternative leaders who will represent politically France in the future. And de Gaulle won't accept any of this. Anytime that it looks like Britain is trespassing on French territory in the Middle East or in West Africa, there's another explosion of anger and irritation and so on. And de Gaulle constantly summons up these historical images of perfidious Albion, l'Albion perfide, which are just innate in those kind of French patriots. And he says on one occasion when he's having a row with some British officer, he says, "You think I'm interested in England's victory? I am not. I am only interested in France's victory." So there's this sense of separation, even though he is totally dependent on British hospitality and British support to do anything.
Yeah, despite these disagreements and friction over the course of the war and the fighting, despite both of them having really very volcanic tempers, Churchill and de Gaulle seem at this stage to maintain quite a warm personal relationship.
Yes, they can just move to and fro. They are quite volcanic temperaments, and Churchill is perfectly capable of exploding and then being very emollient and so on. So one example, which was told by Jock Colville, Churchill's private secretary, long-suffering private secretary, in September 1941, de Gaulle is summoned to 10 Downing Street for another ticking off about something he's done. And Churchill's in a really huffy mood, and he says, "I'm only going to speak to de Gaulle in English." And he tells Colville, who's got reasonably good French, to act as interpreter. So when de Gaulle arrives, sits down in the cabinet room, Churchill declares very sternly, "General de Gaulle, I have asked you to come here this afternoon." And then he pauses for a translation. And so Colville says, "Mon général, je vous ai invité de venir cet après-midi." Churchill stops him. He says, "I didn't say mon général, and I did not say that I have invited him." So Colville stumbles on for a few more sentences, constantly interrupted by Churchill and corrected by him. Then de Gaulle replies. Colville translates it into English, and then de Gaulle protests that that wasn't what he'd said at all. So after a few more rounds of this, Churchill sends Colville out in disgrace. Another foreign office official who's known for very good French comes in. The same business happens again. And eventually he's sent off, very indignant at the criticisms of his French. So these two men are left there in the cabinet room for, 45 minutes, an hour or something like this. And Colville's beginning to wonder what's going on. Have they murdered each other or what? And eventually he contrives some bogus message so he can knock on the door. And what does he find? He finds Churchill and de Gaulle chatting away amiably in French, and de Gaulle smoking one of Churchill's prized cigars. So it's an example of the way they made their own business in a completely unique and idiosyncratic way.
So then, after December 1941, British-French relations, which are already pretty complicated, are further complicated by American entry into the war.
Yes. Franklin Roosevelt has no time for de Gaulle personally. And he also believes very strongly that France is finished as a major power after the collapse of 1940. He feels the French have just really wimped out. And so now we get a whole lot of aggro between France and the United States. There's a big row in the turn of 1941-42 when French forces unilaterally occupy some Vichy-controlled islands off the coast of Canada. Even bigger is the question of the torch landings in North Africa in November 1942. The forces going in at the beginning are only American, not British, because Roosevelt has this conceit that Vichy authorities would cooperate better with the Americans, the liberators, the people who'd supported the French Revolution long ago, rather than the colonial rivals, the British. De Gaulle's only informed of the invasion of French territory as the troops are going ashore. And the first reaction is he says he hopes the people of Vichy will throw them into the sea. A few days later, the Americans make a deal with Admiral Darlan, who is Pétain's deputy, who'd been captured in Algeria. And Darlan is allowed by the Americans to assume power in French North Africa in return for delivering a ceasefire.
So Darlan was a rival power to de Gaulle. This must have put Churchill in an awkward position with de Gaulle.
Yes, Churchill gives pragmatic support to the Darlan deal, and he starts to distance himself from de Gaulle. And he tells the House of Commons in a secret speech that they must not place all their hopes and confidences on de Gaulle. He says that de Gaulle is not one of those unfaltering friends of Britain, but a man who has an almost traditional antagonism that French have towards the British after centuries of warfare. That particular problem is simplified when Darlan is assassinated at Christmas 1942, and that pretty much finishes off the idea of any further deals with the Vichy authorities.
But the Allies still look for alternative French leaders. Why do they do that when they've got de Gaulle there?
Well, because they're not happy with de Gaulle, and they feel that de Gaulle does not represent France politically. He's the military spokesman. Right. He's the military leader. But they're going to have to bring together and develop a French government that will be far more than de Gaulle when eventually the war has come to an end. And de Gaulle won't accept this. He won't work with the general that the British and Americans feel could be the basis of a unified administration, a man called Henri Giraud. De Gaulle, in fact, stomps out in some of these discussions. And as he does so, Churchill says, just look at him. His country has given up fighting. He himself is a refugee. And if we turn him down, he's finished. But just look at him. Look at him. He might be Stalin with 200 divisions behind his words. And that's almost the difficulty of working with a man of this huge theatrical sense that de Gaulle has, and also this massive sense of the position and significance of France, even though it's in the dust at the moment. Eventually, de Gaulle does do a deal with Giraud, but then, given his particular charisma and determination, he manages to marginalize Giraud within what was called the French Committee of National Liberation. So de Gaulle gets his own way after a good deal of storm and uproar and so on.
So although he was seen as the representative of the French military, he's also quite good at politics.
Yeah.
And in watching these machinations, it seems that Roosevelt in particular really develops an increasing antipathy towards de Gaulle. And that confronts Churchill with a very difficult choice. Do you go for the American special relationship or the French entente cordiale?
Yes, and that comes to a head, I think, in May 1943 when Churchill's in Washington and Roosevelt presses him to break formally with de Gaulle. Churchill cables the cabinet, and he's now been listening for several days to Roosevelt, so he's got very much of that Roosevelt language in his mind, and so there's a diatribe to the cabinet from Churchill about de Gaulle as a vain and even malignant man who hates England and has left a trail of Anglophobia behind him everywhere. And it takes Anthony Eden, the foreign secretary, who is more skeptical of the US as an ally and certainly as a long-term ally in the peace, to push back and say that we need to build a relationship with France as well as part of the post-war planning. We can't simply gamble all on the United States. And so then it becomes a row between Churchill and Eden. There's more explosions from the Prime Minister. He says de Gaulle has symptoms of a budding furor. It's a wonderful phrase. And this was now very much an issue about the special relationship, the entente cordiale, and the balance of power within Churchill's government, Churchill versus Eden.
Right.
So the relationship with de Gaulle continues, but he remains on the margins of the Allied war effort. He's not consulted about the Italian surrender. He's excluded from the Big Three meeting at Tehran in November 1943. And also, Roosevelt refuses to bring de Gaulle into the planning for D-Day, for the liberation of France, his own country. De Gaulle's only brought over from Algiers on the 4th of June, 2 days before D-Day, to be told that France is about to be liberated. And Roosevelt also refuses to accept de Gaulle's committee as the provisional government of France. So Churchill and de Gaulle have a blazing row on the eve of D-Day. They both write at length about it in their memoirs. But de Gaulle's passage, I think, is particularly significant. He says that Churchill's language was this: "You must know that when we have to choose between Europe and the open sea, we shall always choose the open sea. Each time I have to choose between you and Roosevelt, I will choose Roosevelt." Now, Churchill's account is a little less colourful than that, but that's how de Gaulle remembered those words. And as de Gaulle's biographer, Julian Jackson, said, they rankled for the rest of his life, and he would often return to them.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. And de Gaulle also wasn't even allowed back into France until the 14th of June, a whole week after the invasion. Mm. And Roosevelt assumed that de Gaulle, I suppose, would be eclipsed by other French leaders at this point. But actually, de Gaulle bucked all the expectations.
Yeah. His return was handled very carefully and effectively in terms of PR. He started building up an image for himself through a walkabout in Bayeux. So remember, this is a man who's really actually only been heard in occupied France. The Voice, if you tuned in to clandestine radio broadcasts, there wouldn't have been many images available. The Germans would have controlled that. So de Gaulle is now spreading his wings. He's meeting people. He's being photographed. He's being filmed as part of this publicity drive. Well, to put it in an irreverent way, the word is finally made flesh. You know, the voice that you've heard, you now say, and there is a man of huge stature to go with that convincing and inspirational voice. And then the walkarounds, which, of course, convey very clearly the huge height of de Gaulle against pretty much all the population. That again makes you think, great man, all the rest of it. And then on the 25th of July, when the Germans evacuate Paris, he stages an entry for himself to the liberated city, gives a really virtuoso speech at the Hôtel de Ville, and speaks of France liberated by itself, liberated by its armies. There's no mention of the British. There's certainly no thanks for the Americans or the Allied armies. This is France liberated by itself. So we just kind of bracketed out the last few years, and normal business is being resumed. It's almost as if the Germans, hadn't walked into Paris in the first place.
Yeah.
And next day he walks down the Champs-Élysées. There's a sort of incredible extravaganza, huge crowds. And after seeing pictures of this, Roosevelt's forced to recognize that you have to live with him. He is later received at the White House. Diplomatic recognition follows in October 1944. So huge testimony to the persistence, the willpower of de Gaulle, creating himself as the political leader of France, not just a minor military general, but still sidelined by the Allies. He's not invited to the Yalta Conference, the big three, Churchill, Roosevelt and Stalin at Yalta in February 1945. And it's only through pressure from Churchill and from Eden at that conference that the French are given a zone in Germany, a zone of occupation in Germany, and a place on the Control Commission for Germany. This is indicative still of this reluctance, certainly on Roosevelt's part and also on Stalin's part, to elevate France to the rank of equals, if you like. Churchill now is taking seriously the fears of Eden and the Foreign Office that if the United States does withdraw from Europe after the war, and Roosevelt's made it very clear that Congress will not let him keep American troops in Europe for very long after peace is there. So Churchill and Eden want France as a counterbalance to keep Germany down, and also at the back of their minds to counterbalance the Soviet Union.
I was very struck by a line from Winston Churchill you quote in the book. England's grievous offence in de Gaulle's eyes is that she has helped France. He cannot bear to think she needed help. And in his memoirs, de Gaulle writes of the unfair advantage taken by England of wounded France. And in the post-war years, he takes his revenge for these perceived hurts by keeping Britain out of the European Economic Community in the 1960s.
Yes, this is the end game of the saga. Churchill does have his vision of a post-war United States of Europe in a speech in Zurich in September 1946. He talks about it again as Prime Minister when he comes back in 1951. He welcomes the European coal and steel community, the bringing together of countries like France and Germany, as well as the Benelux countries, as a measure of progress towards a more united and peaceful Europe. He doesn't want Britain to be integrally part of this process, but what he comes up with this idea that Britain will be at the center of three interlinked circles, as he talks about it, three circles. So there's the British Empire and Commonwealth. There's what he calls the English-speaking world, which includes the United States, and then also United Europe. Britain's in those three circles is the country that, in a sense, holds them all together, but is not simply reduced to any one of those circles, and certainly not to United Europe. Now, at this stage, de Gaulle is very Eurosceptic, as we would put it now, certainly fears a revival of German power. He's worried, therefore, that a united Europe could simply be a route to an enlarged Germany. It's another route to a German empire, if you like. But by the time de Gaulle comes back as president in 1958, the European Economic Community is a fact. It's been created at the beginning of that year. So it's a fait accompli. And when Britain applies to join the European Economic Community in the early 60s under Harold Macmillan, the Tory Prime Minister, de Gaulle vetoes this. He says in a famous speech in January 1963 that England looks to the sea, an echo of that comment that he made to Churchill in 1944. It's tied to the US by language, by custom, and so on. It's not properly European. And indeed, if you let Britain into Europe, it would be a Trojan horse for the Americans, whose influence he wants to keep out or minimize because he wants the European Economic Community, now it exists, to be shaped by France at the center of it. So this is where de Gaulle, I think, gets his revenge for all those years of British hospitality and Rooseveltian contempt. And he maintains that veto for the rest of his political life. It's only after he dies in 1969 that negotiations can begin for Britain to join. And by the time Britain eventually does join in 1973, that's 15 years after the EEC was formed, it's been set in ways that are unhelpful, to say the least, to British interests. The club, the six, have formed their own club rules, and they are not going to let other people in unless they accept those rules. And those rules were very beneficial to France, French agriculture, France's colonial possessions, and so on. And that was the legacy that de Gaulle left, even though eventually the Trojan horse did come in.
Yeah. Throughout the war, de Gaulle comes across as obstinate, disruptive, clearly not afraid of confrontation and appearing to be disagreeable, insisting on what he wants. Strangely, these thorn in your side tactics do prove to be quite effective at times, though.
Yes, this, what it seems to the British at times and seems to us now almost comical insistence on the dignity of France at every stage. And I think that's understandable if you put yourself in his position. His country has been utterly humiliated. He can't admit that in public, but he knows it in his gut in a really profound way. He's also a person with this deep and highly romanticized sense of French history, which is characterized, as is true with British history from our perspective, by constant battles between the British and the French. And so it's almost as if he has to make a point every time. He has to keep insisting on speaking his own language, pushing others to do interpreting. He has to emphasize the rights of France, any bit of French territory that the British are trespassing on, no explosions and all the rest of it, because he is in such an impossible position. And I think you have to have that mentality in order to be able to behave in the way he did. But this is a man who believes genuinely that it's through acts of willpower and acts of his willpower that the grandeur of France can be rehabilitated. It kind of played off. And Churchill was amazed about the way de Gaulle just presented himself as the leader of a great country, even though he clearly wasn't in 1943, 44 or whatever. And here's another comment that Churchill makes, which I think is great fun. He says, after there's been a difficult dinner between Churchill and de Gaulle in Marrakesh in North Africa in 1944, and he tells some friends in London when he gets back, he says, he sort of summarizes the conversation for them. And it's as if the conversation goes, look here, I'm the leader of a strong and unbeaten country. Yet every morning when I wake up, my first thought is, how can I please President Roosevelt? And my second is, how can I conciliate Marshal Stalin? Your situation, Churchill's saying to de Gaulle, your situation is very different. So why then should your first waking thought be, how can you snap your fingers at the British and the Americans? And that irritates Churchill, but also draws a sense of admiration for the sheer chutzpah of this character. De Gaulle's strategy, I think, is that your first response to any request is to say no, it mustn't be, because that establishes your dignity and your position. You might that way actually get what you want. If after some further thought you feel, well, okay, maybe I need to work it out, then when you eventually say yes, you get the benefit of their gratitude for the fact that you have come around. And reading that, I think of my definition, if you like, of the special relationship, the British approach to all this, which I would summarize as dealing with the Americans. It's almost as if the motto is never say no, say yes, but. And you say the yes loudly in public to show solidarity. And then you say the but quietly behind closed doors to just gently tilt American policy in a different direction.
Yeah.
So you've got the French no, and you've got the British yes, but. And I would say you can see that carrying right on to the 21st century, to the era of Macron and Boris Johnson and Rishi Sunak and so on.
I mean, so far we've talked about Churchill in relationship with rivals, mentors, allies to whom he's the suitor. In this relationship, de Gaulle naturally should be the suitor to Churchill, but it doesn't feel like that kind of relationship. And you can see why Churchill will get so frustrated.
Yes, well, Churchill certainly feels that de Gaulle should react in that way and should be appreciative of the courtesies and the help that have been given. But for de Gaulle to act as a suitor would mean, well, I think he would say, then I'm no longer de Gaulle. I am no longer France. France does not pay suit to anybody. That's his image.
Looking back from today, Churchill's vision of Britain, as you put it, at the centre of three global circles, it looks almost as unrealistic in some ways as some of de Gaulle's defiant rhetoric during World War II. Both men had a kind of heroic, romantic sense of their country's past. Ultimately, though, they're both men out of time. They're unwilling to face up to the full impact of the war on their countries.
Yes, in a way they couldn't afford to, I think. These are men so immersed in their country's past, valuing it so much, it's almost like they drape themselves in the mantle of the past, and that is what they mean by the identity of their country. They're both larger-than-life characters. They're formidable statesmen who, I think, also develop a sneaking regard for each other, because in a way, each is the mirror image of the other. It's that same sense of belief in human willpower as the basis of leadership. It's the belief in the greatness of the country. It's the conviction that I embody the country. These things are characteristics that they both share. But the Second World War undermines the greatness of both of those countries. So Britain and France are still significant countries, but they're no longer major players on the world stage. Churchill and de Gaulle both had their finest hour in 1940 to 45. But by the end of that war, they'd become what you might call the pallbearers of national greatness.
Roosevelt really doesn't like de Gaulle right from the start. Is it about political style that Roosevelt is, as he calls himself, a juggler, that he doesn't show his hand too much? And that de Gaulle is absolutely the polar opposite. He's obstructive and right out of the gate, he's making his views clear.
Part of it, but I think Roosevelt's worldview really doesn't have a place for de Gaulle or for France after the way they have been seen to have behaved in 1940. Roosevelt's worldview doesn't have a huge place for Britain. Britain is there. It has to be there because Britain is the only outpost of freedom on the edge of the European continent. It's the only base from which a landing on the continent or liberation of the continent can be launched. But very much the view is that Britain will be the junior partner in this relationship, and that the country to take seriously and to try and fathom is the Soviet Union, the coming power in the future. And so I think that Roosevelt's aversion to de Gaulle on a personal level accentuates that basic point that France is just not a big player now, however much that, snooty, big-nosed Frenchman is trying to say so.
It just shows what a shock June 1940 was.
Yeah, it's a shock to everyone. That's, I think, why it's so significant that Churchill does manage to regroup and say, okay, our relationship with France now is going to be totally different. And France, in many ways, is now peripheral, though useful in 1940 as a sign that Britain's not totally alone. And he is now working with a completely different set of allies. But yes, I've always felt for a long, long time that 1940 is in many ways the kind of fulcrum, the tipping point of the 20th century. It's when we move from an age in which the Europeans, to a large extent, control their own destiny, to one in which the Europeans are very much in interaction with the two emerging superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. And 1940 is very much the tipping point of that. Once Hitler controls the whole of Europe, it requires the force of the United States and the Soviet Union to change that. And the world and the shape of Europe will never be the same again because of the entrance of the US and the Soviet Union into European politics in a serious way.
You've been listening to David Reynolds and Russell Barnes in Creating Churchill. Please rate, review, and recommend our show on your favourite podcast app. Follow us at @creating_hist on X or Instagram, and send us your comments and questions by email to info@clearstory.co.uk. Creating History is produced and edited by Russell Barnes, with music by Rich Farnsworth, digital marketing by Lee Mann, and sound engineering by Andrew Chappell. Creating Churchill is a Clear Story, Creating History production.